There are many ways to build a character based on their kits, their team compositions, intended role, and also what weapons and artifacts you happen to have available to you. Understanding the general principles on how you go about building a character should help you start to grasp how to build any character. It would take hours to walk through all the possible builds for all the available characters, so instead we'll focus on two very different builds for one character. First, let's walk through the basic steps I tend to follow when building a character, then we'll show the real in-game examples. The first step is to decide which role we want the character to fulfill. It's possible to figure out which roles character might be suited for by reading through the descriptions of their talents and constellations, but it's a lot easier to ask an expert instead. The role we aim for determines what artifact stats we need to focus on and which weapon passes will be useful. Once we know what role we're aiming for, the next step is to pick the character's weapon. Most players will have a small set of potential weapons to choose from compared to the variety of available artifacts, so it makes most sense to start with the weapon. The right weapon will provide a great start on filling out the stats we care about, which will then help us make decisions about what artifacts to pick. Next up is the goblet. Goblets have by far the most variety in terms of stats available, so it's the slot most likely to be from some random artifact set, especially for a damage dealing character, commonly called an offset piece. Our priority here is a goblet with the ideal main stat and some useful substats. The set isn't important at all at this point. After the goblet, the next step is the flower and the feather. Both of these slots have a static main stat, all flowers are HP, all feathers are attack, which means they are generally the most flexible artifacts. We should prioritize the artifact substats for these slots, plus this is often the time to start aiming for 1 or 2 useful artifact sets. Next, the sands. Similar to Goblet, our main focus here is the main stat and substats, though this is often the point at which we start looking at trade-offs between picking an offset artifact with better stats versus an onset artifact with worse stats. Usually the right choice for that kind of trade-off is to pick the artifact with the better stats. Then we pick the circlet. This also has a variety of available main stats and follows a similar thought process to picking the sands. Once we have a weapon and 5 artifacts picked, it's time to re-evaluate the character's stats and tweak the build if necessary. At this point, we'll often start juggling artifacts around to increase one stat at the expense of another, or maybe even switch the weapon to a different one if our artifact skews strongly towards one stat. If we're ever unsure what artifact main stats to aim for a particular slot, we can click this attribute reference button up here to get a rough idea of what people tend to use in that slot for that character's most popular build. Let's look at 2 very different builds for Yanfei. First, we'll give her a more typical build as a main DPS, which you'd use if you want her to be your main damage dealer. Second, we'll build her as a shielder, which is something you unlock with her 4th constellation, and though it is a much rarer role for Yanfei, she's surprisingly good for it. These builds are on an AR-59 account, with many good weapons and heavily invested artifacts, plus some extremely good luck along the way. As a result, these builds will involve fewer trade-offs than you'd often need to make, especially if you're earlier on in the game. However, the same general steps and reasoning apply regardless of the strength of your artifacts and weapons, so it's worth seeing what to aim for regardless. When built as a DPS, Yanfei's build requirements follow a very common pattern which is shared by a large number of characters in the game. The first thing we need to know is where Yanfei's damage comes from. For some characters, this will be their skill or burst, but in Yanfei's case, most of her strength comes from her charged attacks. For a typical DPS build like this, we want to focus on 3 things: attack, elemental damage, and crit. Some elemental mastery would also be worthwhile to increase the strength of her reactions. For some characters in this role we would want energy recharge too, but since Yanfei doesn't rely on her burst, we can largely ignore it. While the artifact set is the least impactful part of the build, we can aim to give her a 4-piece Wanderer's Troop set, since this is tailor-made for Yanfei and also gives her a noticeable damage boost. Other possible full sets to aim for would be the Crimson Witch of Flames, Lava Walker's and Shimenawa's Reminiscence, or we could use 2-piece combinations of a number of sets. However, as I always say, the most important thing to aim for is good artifact pieces. The sets are a lesser priority. The Eye of Perception would be a decent weapon to use with its attack stat. However, since attack is one of the easier to acquire stats on artifacts, we have better options. The Solar Pearl, for example, has a crit rate substats, so it would be a good choice. However, this account is lucky enough to have several copies of Yanfei's best-in-slot weapon, the Lost Prayer of Sacred Winds. It has a slightly stronger crit rate substat than the Solar Pearl, but with a much higher base attack, and a passive which is very useful for Yanfei. This will likely be our best choice. Our second choice will be the Witsith, which has a crit damage stat. While Lost Prayer would be ideal due to its higher base attack and more reliable passive, if our artifacts happen to give a lot of crit rate and subpar crit damage, the Witsith might make for a stronger build overall. With that in mind, let's start on the artifacts. First, we want a pyro damage bonus goblet. Ignoring the unleveled artifacts, we have just two options here. Both have a decent crit damage substat, which would go well with our Lost Prayer weapon. While the Gladiator set could be a potential 2-piece set we might want to use, for now we'll go for the other one, since it also has a crit rate substat, which is very valuable for our Yanfei. For the Flower and Feather, we'll start by filtering to see only artifacts in the Wanderer's Troop set, to see if we have the strong enough artifacts that we could aim for the 4-piece bonus from that set. We have quite a few leveled Wanderer's Flowers, all of which have useful substats. We'll pick this one to start with because of its very high crit damage stat, but we now know that we can tweak our build later on by swapping it out. Our Wanderer's Feather situation is fairly similar. We have a number of decent options, all with slight pros and cons. We'll pick this one since it has a good amount of crit damage, plus it'll boost our crit rate and our elemental mastery. Next, let's pick the Sands. For a DPS build, we'll almost always want an attack Sands. As we can see here, almost 3/4 of people picked this as the main stat for this slot. We're lucky enough to have 4 leveled attack sands in the Wanderer set, including 3 which would be pretty close to a perfect due to their crit rate substat. This one is the strongest of the 3, so let's use that. Finally, let's pick out our circlet. Currently our build has a decent amount of attack, a pyro goblet and a very healthy 62 to 126 critical hit ratio, so we have a lot of flexibility for this final artifact. We want to keep as close to a 1 to 2 crit ratio as possible to maximize damage, so while we have some very strong crit rate main stat artifacts, this crit damage one is arguably our best overall. This gives us an extremely strong result with 78 to 189 crit ratio, a good amount of attack and pyro damage bonus too. This Yanfei build is strong enough to beat even the hardest content in the game. For example, the mono pyro team you can see here has been particularly brilliant against recent abyss floors with lots of electro enemies. When built as a shielder, Yanfei's build requirements are very different. Again, the first thing we need to know is what stats are important here. Since Yanfei's shield scales based on her HP, we'll aim to give her a lot of HP. Her shield is created when we use her elemental burst, so energy recharge is also valuable. This actually means that shielder Yanfei build is highly flexible. Many different artifact sets would be valuable for Yanfei herself. For example, 2-piece Emblem would help with her energy needs, while 2-piece Millilith would give her an HP boost. But we could also build her with a set that would benefit the other team members. For example, a 4-piece Noblesse set would give everyone else in the team an attack boost. For this build, we have several different weapon options. Wandering Evenstar would buff the teammate's attack, but it's not ideal for this build. Its passive relies on a character having high elemental mastery stats, which isn't something Yanfei's shield benefits from. Similarly, Favonius Codex would be great if we want Yanfei to generate a lot of energy, but it requires a decent crit rate, which is unlikely given we're focusing on HP. The most popular option for this build would be the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, which gives a hefty attack boost to Yanfei's teammates. Another interesting option would be the prototype Amber, which would turn her into an even more general support, with both healing and energy regeneration provided by its passive. Both of these weapons have a HP stat, which would increase the strength of her shield too. I like the idea of Yanfei fulfilling many roles, so for now let's go with the prototype Amber. It would be easy to switch between the two later on. Now on to the artifacts. This account doesn't have a huge collection of Noblesse artifacts, but since HP is a relatively common main stat, it's worth seeing whether we can start working towards the 4-piece set. Turns out we're lucky enough to have an on-set HP Goblet, however it doesn't have any energy recharge on its substats, so we may want to use an off-piece artifact regardless. For now we'll pick the Noblesse one, since it's a set we don't have a huge inventory of, but we might choose an alternative later on. Next, the flower and feather. For both of these slots, we happen to have a decent option with both HP percentage and energy recharge substats. Perfect. For the sand, again, we happen to have a HP artifact with energy recharge substat, so we've got extremely lucky here. Usually with such a small number of artifacts for the set we're looking for, we expect to lack one with the main stat we want, let alone a combination of both main stat and substats like we have here. Finally, the circlet, and yet again we happen to have a noblesse artifact with HP main stat and energy recharge as a substat. This gives us a great opportunity to improve our build. Now we have 5 artifacts on one set, so we can switch any of them to an artifact from a different set without losing the 4-piece bonus. Out of the 5, only the goblet lacks energy recharge substat, so it makes sense to swap that out for something which will be more useful. It's possible that we could gain more of a boost by switching out one of the other artifacts. For example, our circlet only has 5% ER, so we may have another artifact with a significantly stronger substat for that slot, in which case it could be better overall to keep the on-set goblet. It's often worth poking around your artifacts and seeing whether you can eke out a little bit more by switching things around. This gives us a build with over 33,000 HP and an energy recharge stat of 164%. Her shield should absorb over 15,000 damage, which is comparable to the shield strength of a well-built Zhongli, and she also heals, regenerates energy, and provides a 20% attack buff thanks to her equipment. I haven't yet used this build for any serious fighting, but it's definitely one I'll try out for real someday. When building characters, it's important to remember that the exact numbers to target depend on a number of factors, and while there are some general principles which work for many characters, there are also many caveats and exceptions that you do need to check for every character you build. It's always worth either searching for advice online or asking for help, and whenever I'm live on Twitch, I'm always happy to give some advice. If you found this useful, please let me know in the comments down below. If you're interested, I could follow this up with a build comparison for other characters too. For example, exploring the different builds characters like Keqing or Lisa would need for an Aggravate team versus a Hyperbloom team could be worthwhile. Until next time!